Good evening again, and welcome again to the Leadership Lecture Series, Alumni Speak. It's a series of talks that we actually initiated in last November, and I think this is the 6th or 7th one. I'm starting to lose count, which is a good sign because it means that we have had several alumni come and talk to our students, our faculty, and some of the local alumni as well on various subjects and matters on which they are well-recognized experts. So this is one more in the series of talks. Our speaker today is Mr. Sandy Chandra. He is a 1973 alumnus, BTech Chemical Engineering, and he has done a variety of things in his career, and I'm sure he will lead you through that journey in his talk. He's a consultant to many companies, and as he was just explaining to our director, Professor Bhaskar, his main focus is really on turning around companies and salvaging their fortunes and future. And he primarily works with the core companies, but in a variety of areas. So without further ado, I'll invite Sandy to address you and accept a bouquet on our behalf.
Friends, it gives me great pleasure to return back to IIT Madras campus after several years. I had absolutely a wonderful experience at IIT over 38 years ago, and a lifelong connection to IIT through my wife's father, Dr. E.G. Ramachandran, who was the head of the Department of Metallurgy. He was one of the founding professors of IIT. So I have spent an enormous amount of time here at IIT, except in the last 25 years I have not been here. I also, needless to say, my romance with my wife started in this beautiful environments of IIT Madras, so it's a very special place for me. It was not easy then, I can tell you that. I have been asked to speak on the topic of entrepreneurship. The status of businessmen changed some years ago. When I was growing up, when I actually met my father-in-law, first thing he said is, don't ever go into business. If you're a businessman, you must be a crook. So it started with that. But today, an entrepreneur is highly regarded, especially if you're a technologist. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg have taken care of that through incredible amount of entrepreneurship, value creation that they have done to this world. I also must mention my classmate Desh Deshpande, who is a serial entrepreneur, first class, who has built more value than one can imagine. I'm also sure that many of you will look to be entrepreneurs in your career. And there is a tried and tested route that is become the norm today. You graduate from IIT, go to work for a blue chip company. Then you go to a business school. Sometimes directly out of IIT you go to a business school. Then you go and work for McKinsey, Google, or Goldman Sachs. They are the partners of choice because they pay you the best. Then you understand what the VCs are looking for. And then you, based on some knowledge that you have, you create a startup. You then sell, exit the business, put some money in your bank, and play golf for the rest of your life. I think this is a typical entrepreneurship that we talk about both here in India, more in the Valley in the US, and quite a bit in India as well these days. I want to walk you through a broader view of entrepreneurship and conceptualize how that broader definition of entrepreneurship can change the world. I'm particularly interested in how it can change India. To me, entrepreneurship begins with dreaming. Dreaming that the world needs something different. Conceptualizing how to make that difference and executing a plan to make that difference. I want to start the discussion with how I've turned some of my own dreams into entrepreneurial ventures. I would also like to discuss some of the practical things I've learned along the way. It's been a 30-year journey, so it's quite a bit of learning that I've done. So I'm be very happy to share some of that with you. Finally, I also would like to discuss the principles of entrepreneurship as applied particularly to the nation building, which is something that I passionately care about. My own entrepreneurial journey started somewhere in the 1980s. I was about 30 years old, working as a chemical engineer in New Jersey. I was one of the few graduating class of 1973 chemical engineering batch actually did chemical engineering. Most of my gold medalists and the silver medalists went on to become accountants, airline managers, and so on and so forth. When I worked in New Jersey in 1970s, it was a different place. Anytime I talked about India, people talked about the Hindu rate of growth, 1 to 2% per annum, when we created more poverty than we created middle class. It was a hard time to sell India to anybody at that point in time. I'd spent enough time in the US to understand that the free market created vast middle class and incredible wealth. The command and control economy of India created license controls, quotas, import restrictions, and India was not able to catch up with the rest of the world for nearly 30 years. Living in Gandhian simplicity was a virtue, but the politicians translated it as living in poverty. That was a period that I went to the US. Most of the people who went to the US at that point in time never came back. Everybody decided to stay on. I left India with about $100 in my pocket. I had left home when I was 15 to study alone in Delhi. And then I came to IIT Madras, and then I went on to the US. I did not think that I would ever get into IIT, but somehow I got in. When I went to the US, I started working for a company called ABB Lummus. Lummus is considered to be the greatest technology licensor for the petroleum, petrochemical, oil, and gas fields. I had an opportunity to work as a trainee there for about a year, and that was a job that I had. The job that I had was about conceptualizing and designing some of the largest projects around the world. It's a very rare opportunity that one got. Ability to think big, ability for you to be investing billions of dollars on behalf of your clients like Mobil, Exxon, and a whole range of these large companies. I had an opportunity to work with some of the best conceptual technology thinkers, both on the cryogenic side as well as on the cracking side. And later on, I worked in a synthetic fuel plant that converted coal into gas. And finally, I washed up on the shores of Iraq in a city of Basra to be looking after the building and construction and being a process consultant to one of the largest petrochemical complexes being built in the Middle East at that time. Iraq was a challenging assignment, to say the least. I worked 16 hours a day in a heat of 50 degrees centigrade, 55 degrees. But it was a great opportunity because nobody else was working. So I had an opportunity to work. We had some deadlines to meet, so I was given the opportunity to work on those deadlines. So instead of being a process thinker, I ended up being a mechanic. I opened up compressors, I opened up gas turbines, I opened up whatever I could find to see whether they were in good enough condition for it to be started up. At some point in my career, I also became a construction supervisor, dealing with a bunch of British and Yugoslavian labor. Finally, I ended up starting up the plant, only a portion of it, which is already worth about $400 million. But what this did do was to transform me forever. I was no longer this cheap immigrant engineer who washed up on the shores of the United States. I escaped the Iranian bombs by a few days. A number of my friends got killed, but nevertheless, but what did that experience did for me is something nothing else has done. Within a few years after that, I ended up becoming the executive assistant to the chairman of Lummus. I was one of the few people who could go all the way from being a process engineer all the way to being a construction guy to actually dealing in very real-time plant startups. So I had a global view of licensing, global view of contracting, and strictly spoken, I should have gone on to pursue to a corporate role, and I'm very sure that I would have done reasonably well in the US markets. However, my dream was then that India could have a very high technology energy infrastructure that it needed to grow its economy. I proposed to my bosses at that time creating an engineering capability in India. They laughed at me, they rejected the proposal summarily, and their only comment was India is a difficult place to do business. And of course, as usual, they talked about the Hindu rate of growth. China and Russia were acceptable, but India was not. We are talking in the 80s. I persevered, believing that there was the time was going to be right for India at some point to emerge out of a stupor. I presented the case to all and sundry, all the way to the top, including the parent company. In time, my mentor, who was a very wise chemical engineer who graduated from Cooper Union, had risen up right to the top as a chairman, relented, and at the age of 33, I came to India to be the managing director and country head for the company. This was a period of time, if you will realize, if you wanted to be a country head, you had to be a white skin. So I did manage to get here. We had all the technology and all the expertise. We had the ability to license, but we didn't have a partner at that time. So it was a greenfield location for us. We were used to building large petrochemical complexes, and India was still thinking about it. And one such trip, just before I came to India, I met with a man called Dhirubhai Ambani in Mumbai, and rest was history. He was the greatest dreamer that I've ever met in my life. He started life working in a petrol station in the Gulf, and then turned into a cloth trading merchant in Mumbai, and then turned into one of the largest producer of polyester in India. When I met Dhirubhai in 1985, he saw chemicals as the future, and he didn't want to be a garment manufacturer anymore, and he wanted to build refineries. All he had was a vision, and he had the confidence. He had the ability to tell me that he can raise as much money he wanted. I can guarantee right now to you, he didn't have the money then. But he dreamt so big, it's not even funny. I had the technology and the conceptual vision of a great petrochemical venture starting from exploration, and he had the drive. And both of us believed that India needed the best technologies. During the next 6 years, we made that happen in Patalganga, Hazira, and Jamnagar, which became some of the largest and the most modern petrochemical complexes in the world. Reliance was the sponsor, and we were the technology provider. We transformed a $200 million company then in what today is a $20 billion enterprise. I'm not saying that we did it, they did it, but what we did for them was truly entrepreneurial. I realized that with vision and hard work and never giving up, dreams can come true. And my life as an entrepreneur was born.